Captain Dale Dye. Welcome to Conquerors. In 1805, Napoleon Bonaparte's tactics of speed and surprise enabled his Grand Army to march over 700 miles and crush the two largest armies in Europe. The primary weapon in his arsenal was this, the Gribeauval 8-pounder. Now, this cannon outranged the Austrian and Russian 6-pounders and had significantly more hitting power. Most importantly, it was more maneuverable. But the primary weapon of the era was Napoleon's mind. His tactics and daring at the Battle of Austerlitz established his reputation as one of history's greatest commanders.
2 de dezembro de 1805, Napoleão Bonaparte, imperador da França, observava um campo amortalhado pela neblina. Seus soldados estavam prestes a enfrentar as forças da Áustria e da Rússia, perto da aldeia de Austerlitz. 200.000 homens lutariam na mais notável batalha da carreira épica de Napoleão. Aqui ele armaria uma grande armadilha e obteria sua maior vitória. Quando o sol irrompeu por entre as nuvens, revelando baionetas reluzentes, chegara o momento de glória de Napoleão.
If someone were to ask me, what one battle in history should I study to learn about military brilliance, about how to lead men, Austerlitz would be the battle I would choose. I mean, it's really impossible to understate how enormous Napoleon becomes in the minds of the generals that will follow him. He exerts a tremendous influence on the American Civil War. Every American general sees in himself that he wants to be the next Napoleon.
A ascensão militar de Napoleão e suas incríveis vitórias fizeram-no uma lenda, como seus heróis Alexandre e César. Em dezembro de 1799, graças às suas habilidades táticas e de liderança, ele se tornou governante da França. Havia conquistado o Egito, a maior parte da Itália, implantado códigos civis e até um novo sistema tributário. Em 1800, a França derrotou o exército austríaco na Itália e na Alemanha, tornando Napoleão o homem mais poderoso e temido da Europa.
Napoleon is the most controversial figure in Europe at this time. And the opinions about him vary widely. I mean, some of his most inveterate enemies can't help but admire him. Ideologically, Napoleon is seen as the son of the French Revolution. So in all the conservative quarters of Europe, he's loathed. Many people feel he's really the Antichrist.
Em 2 de dezembro de 1804, Napoleão coroou-se imperador. Isso abalou toda a Europa. O primeiro cônsul da Revolução estabelecia sua própria monarquia. Os aristocratas europeus não podiam tolerar isso. O que viria em seguida? A conquista de seus reinos?
To many people, he was an amazing person. People flocked to Paris to try to catch a glimpse of this stunning young man who had risen from obscurity to become the leader of one of the great countries of Europe. What they learned by 1805, of course, was that not only was Napoleon this meteor streaking to the top of power in France, but he was a great commander that they could not ignore if they ever chose to take him on.
No início de 1805, Napoleão estava com seu exército de 210.000 homens no porto de Bolonha, aguardando as melhores condições para invadir a Inglaterra. Seu ódio a essa nação, a única a infligir-lhe duras derrotas, tornara-se uma obsessão.
England was determined to get rid of Napoleon. There had been a number of assassination attempts, and it was the British who were financing and organizing that. So Napoleon eventually realized he had to either have a peace treaty with England or he had to conquer England. Well, he tried a peace treaty. In 1802, there was the Peace of Amiens. Ultimately, it was England that refused to withdraw forces from Malta as per the treaty, and so Napoleon decided, well, then I must conquer England.
They had trained for a war that was coming, they thought, with England. Every day, there would be battalion drills. Every other day in the morning, there would be live firing exercises. Now, intense training with soldiers that were already veterans in the wars of the French Revolution. This made Napoleon's Grande Armée, as he dubbed it in late August 1805, the finest army he had ever commanded.
The primary weapon of the French infantry was the Model 1777 Courage en Neuf, better known as the Charleville. The weapon weighed about 10 pounds and was approximately 5 feet long. It fired a relatively light .7-inch ball. For each shot, powder and ball had to be rammed home, and the weapon fired from a flintlock mechanism. A well-trained and disciplined soldier could get off about 5 rounds per minute. But all that black powder left a lot of residue or fouling. So the weapon had to be swabbed out about every 50 shots, or there was a danger it would blow up in your face. If there wasn't any water readily at hand, soldiers simply urinated into the bore and used the acid in the urine to clean it out. Now, in combat, something like that can bring on some serious performance pressure.
Contudo, Napoleão e seu grande exército nunca cruzaram o Canal da Mancha. Em 25 de agosto de 1805, eles tiveram que enfrentar a Inglaterra em um campo de batalha totalmente diferente. William Pitt, primeiro-ministro da Inglaterra, acabara de perder as colônias americanas na Revolução delas. Agora, a França ameaçava o status inglês na Europa. Pitt decidiu formar uma coalizão com seus aliados para frustrar as ambições de Napoleão.
There had been 2 previous coalitions, and this third coalition was going to be the biggest and best yet. Russia got involved because the Tsar, Alexander, believed that he was a messiah that was going to re-energize and restore Europe's old order after the French Revolution. Tsar Alexander was only 27 years old. He was susceptible to flattery and to toadies and sycophants who surrounded him. He believed that he was going to be a great general, but he had no background or had never studied warfare or the military like Napoleon had.
O último líder da terceira coalizão foi Francisco I, imperador da Áustria. Como governante mais conservador da Europa, Francisco era o mais ameaçado pelos ideais igualitários da Revolução Francesa. Ele tinha levado uma surra dos franceses em 1800 e via agora a sua chance de vingar-se. William Pitt pagou os austríacos e russos para esmagarem o recém-coroado imperador francês em terra, enquanto 175 navios ingleses continuariam a interceptar Napoleão por mar. Áustria e Rússia, com uma força conjunta de 200 mil homens, atacariam 2 regiões aliadas dos franceses, a Itália e a Bavária. Um plano de tamanha magnitude não poderia escapar aos espiões de Napoleão, que logo informaram o imperador. Napoleão estava sempre à frente de todos. O grande estrategista usaria a Europa como tabuleiro para derrubar seus inimigos como peões. Em 8 de setembro de 1805, o general Karl Mack conduziu 72 mil soldados austríacos à Bavária. Ao mesmo tempo, as forças aliadas capturaram Hanover e invadiram a Itália. A terceira coalizão atacava a França de todos os ângulos. Com o dobro de homens, cavalos e canhões do que Napoleão, ela parecia invencível. De imediato, Napoleão viu uma falha no plano aliado. As forças deles estavam muito dispersas pelo continente. A comunicação e a coordenação entre esses exércitos multilingües seria quase impossível. Movendo-se rapidamente do seu acampamento na costa, ele poderia atacar os austríacos antes mesmo que os russos chegassem.
He turns his army around and marches it straight east. Unbelievably in complete secrecy. He seals borders. He shuts down newspapers. He sends out bulletins about how wonderful things are on the coast. He leaves some soldiers there to give the impression that he's there. In 40 days, he manages to march all the way across to the front where the Austrians and the Russians are beginning to put their groups together. It's an amazing thing. No one had ever done anything like it.
Essa rapidez foi possível porque Napoleão reorganizara o seu exército. Ao invés de uma força maciça, ele criou 7 corpos. Cada corpo era um exército em miniatura, liderada por um marechal com autonomia para tomar decisões. Tinha sua própria infantaria, cavalaria, artilharia, vias de abastecimento e até equipes médicas. Este sistema de corpos ajudaria Napoleão a defender seu país e conquistar novas terras.
The idea was, though, that they would never be more than a 24-hour march from each other. So if one got in trouble, another one could quickly come in to save the day. That was a far better system for maneuver than the Russian and Austrian systems, which were an old system based on a very central command and requiring enormously difficult communication lines from time to time. But the main thing that the French had that the other folks didn't, of course, was Napoleon himself. The Duke of Wellington is believed to have said at one time that Napoleon's hat on a battlefield was worth 50,000 men.
Em menos de 6 semanas, os corpos franceses alcançaram o rio Danúbio, apanhando o exército austríaco de surpresa. O general Mack resolveu lutar na cidade de Ulm. As ações de Napoleão contra Mack se tornariam lendárias e iniciariam uma campanha que lhe daria sua maior vitória militar, a Batalha de Austerlitz. Agosto de 1805. Napoleão fizera seu grande exército marchar em segredo para defender a França de seu novo inimigo, a Terceira Coalizão. Seus corpos tinham avançado dia e noite, sofrendo grandes privações para interceptar o exército austríaco do general Mack.
The main advantage that the Allies, the coalition against Napoleon had, was sheer numbers. They had huge numbers of soldiers, they had a bigger fleet, they had more money. Mack made the unfortunate decision to move forward into Bavaria for the reason that he believed that Bavaria was going to join Austria against Napoleon. That proved to be completely false.
Em setembro de 1805, o general Karl Mack e seu exército austríaco ocuparam a cidade de Ulm, na Bavária. Ulm era uma sólida posição defensiva para os austríacos. Outros generais haviam atacado a cidade frontalmente, mas Napoleão estava prestes a mudar as regras. Ele armaria uma cilada para Mack.
Napoleon had some experience fighting against coalitions. In his very first campaign, he devised his strategy of divide and conquer, separate the parties and defeat them in detail. The Third Coalition was going to be no exception. He knew that the Austrians would be vulnerable, that it would take the Russians time to get there. Napoleon saw an opportunity to fall upon their rear and flank and encircle and cut them off from the rest of Austria. It's the precedent of the modern blitzkrieg.
Por meio de astúcia e ilusão, Bonaparte enviou corpos contra os austríacos a leste e outro ao redor de Ulm para isolar o general Mack. Em 14 de outubro, o exército austríaco estava cercado em Ulm. Rumores de que Napoleão recuava foram desmentidos por canhonaços nas muralhas da cidade.
As a formally trained artillery officer, Napoleon tended to make cannon the backbone of his tactics. Now, French artillery was generally employed in masked batteries, which means they could be used to soften up an enemy formation prior to musket volleys or a bayonet charge or a cavalry charge. Intense gun crew training allowed Napoleon's batteries to maneuver at high speed, which means that they could be used to reinforce a weak point in a defensive line or to hammer a hole in an enemy formation. Now, French artillery was generally classified as 4-pounder, 6-pounder, 8-pounder, or 12-pounder, depending on the size of the projectile that it fired. Maximum effective ranges? Somewhere out between 600 and 800 meters. Now, let's see what all this French noise is about.
O general Mack esperava que seus soldados suportassem o ataque francês, até que 40 mil russos viessem em seu auxílio. Incrivelmente, a Terceira Coalizão cometera um erro cronológico fatal. No início do século XIX, a Rússia ainda usava o calendário juliano, cujas datas eram 12 dias posteriores às do calendário gregoriano europeu. Por pressa e confiança excessiva, ninguém no comando aliado se dera ao trabalho de lembrar disso.
General Mack is convinced that the Russians will be coming to his aid just any old time now, and in fact they were almost 200 miles away. Well, that's a disaster, as you can well imagine.
Em 20 de outubro de 1805, o general Mack por fim entregou a cidade de Ulm. 27 mil homens e 67 canhões foram os prisioneiros de Napoleão. Mack perdera metade de todo o exército austríaco.
One of the things that became a famous saying after this campaign against Ulm was the fact that the French soldier said their emperor defeated enemies with their legs instead of their arms. Just by marching, just by swinging wide around Mack, they were able to cause his defeat. And it certainly was unprecedented and something no one had seen in Europe up to that time. For this disaster at Ulm, Mack became known as the unfortunate General Mack. He was in fact court-martialed and sentenced to death for this disaster.
Nada agora interpunha-se entre Napoleão e Viena. Em 14 de novembro de 1805, Napoleão liderou seus soldados à capital do antigo Império Austríaco. Francisco I havia fugido, deixando seus palácios para o inimigo. Napoleão desfilou em triunfo pelas ruas. 2 meses antes, ele estivera acampado às margens do Canal da Mancha. Agora, as autoridades vienenses entregavam-lhe a chave da cidade. Seu triunfo, no entanto, foi obscurecido pela notícia de um desastre. A marinha de Napoleão fora destruída na Batalha de Trafalgar.
No longer could he easily go to North Africa, no longer could he go to the Middle East, no longer could he go to his colonies in North America without encountering the British fleet. All ideas of invading England were off the table, and what that meant was he looked eastward in the same way that Hitler did.
Napoleão ordenou que suas tropas avançassem Europa adentro, onde as forças da coalizão estavam acampadas, fora da cidade morávia de Austerlitz. Seria um passo perigoso. Após várias semanas acampado, o grande exército começou a se perguntar se havia caído em uma cilada. Com o inverno se aproximando, a conquista da Áustria talvez fosse a ruína de Napoleão.
It had been terrible for more than a month. The army had suffered horribly from straggling, and the men were hungry, and the numbers continued to shrink daily.
O exército francês estava cercado de inimigos. As forças da coalizão estavam ao norte, e reforços austríacos vindos da Itália ao sul eram aguardados.
Despite the terrific victory at Ulm, Napoleon was not in the best of situations. He needed a battle. He needed to defeat the Russians and what remained of the Austrians, and he needed a conclusion to this campaign.
And there's also the matter of his image. If he leaves now without another great victory, then people are going to say, well, okay, he surprised General Mack at Ulm. Mack was a fool to allow that to happen. But when he was faced with the main Austrian and Russian forces, he turned tail and ran. And some people might say that Napoleon was taking a big gamble by staying and fighting the Allied forces. I don't think so. Napoleon's best option was to stay and fight, to seek one victory that would force a lasting peace.
Napoleão continuou levando seus homens cada vez mais para dentro do território inimigo. Em 20 de novembro, em Auschwitz, 2 divisões da cavalaria francesa foram surpreendidas pelo ataque de 6.000 cavaleiros russos.
These mounted Russian cuirassiers carried a vicious 32-inch straight thrusting saber known as a palash. It had a fuller that ran the entire length of the blade. That made it lighter and gave the blood somewhere to run. These Russian cavalry were also armed with a brace of flintlock pistols like this one for when times got bad. And they did. The Russians initially slashed through the French line, capturing an eagle and a standard, which was immediately delivered to an ecstatic Tsar.
Contudo, após o afrouxamento inicial, os franceses detiveram a cavalaria russa graças à sua superioridade na esgrima. Os franceses eram muito menos numerosos, mas seus ataques disciplinados rechaçaram os russos. Foi uma vitória menor, porém importante para Napoleão.
One of the examples of how Tsar Alexander was really out of touch with reality was the Battle of Rausnitz. What they saw was a tremendous victory with a captured eagle, and they couldn't wait to fight Napoleon because they were convinced that they were going to inflict the same sort of defeat on him at Austerlitz, when the reality was they'd lost at Rausnitz.
Em 22 de novembro de 1805, os exércitos russo e austríaco por fim reuniram-se em uma força única de 90.000 soldados, sob o comando General Mikhail Kutuzov.
Kutuzov was a legendary character in the Russian army. He had survived 2 head wounds, one of which a German doctor, upon seeing the scars, pronounced him a dead man. He knew how to present himself in such a way that he was beloved by the common soldier. Yet at the same time, he led a totally decadent, aristocratic sort of lifestyle. He would travel on campaign with immense amounts of baggage, including an extensive amount of French champagne, and always traveled with several women of lesser virtue. The Tsar described him, quote, as a hatcher of intrigues and an immoral and thoroughly dangerous character.
A maioria dos generais veteranos teria recuado perante uma força de 90 mil homens. Mas Napoleão jamais recuaria. Decidiu atrair os aliados ao combate em território escolhido por ele. Napoleão usaria a ilusão para destruí-los. Ele olhou para seus homens e pensou: mais uma batalha.
Napoleon had chased the Allies as far as he could without the danger of being surrounded and cut off from his supply lines. So he called a halt east of the Allied positions near a town called Brno and had his troops prepare for battle. The local inhabitants were afraid that everything they owned would be devastated in the clash of 2 massive armies. So they sent a contingent of women to seek an audience with Napoleon and beg for mercy. They brought gifts of milk and food, but Napoleon's only appetite was for battle.
Em 24 de novembro de 1805, o czar convocou um conselho de guerra com o imperador Francisco e o general Kutuzov. 3 planos foram sugeridos. O primeiro era manter a posição deles em Olmütz e aguardar reforços austríacos vindos da Itália. O segundo era recuar para leste, atraindo os franceses atrás deles. A última opção era atacar um aparentemente frágil Napoleão. O general Kutuzov declarou que as provisões escasseavam e que se ficassem, passariam fome. Se recuassem, obteriam provisões, mas os franceses encontrariam a zona rural despojada e pereceriam no inverno fatal do leste europeu. Era a melhor opção, mas Kutuzov não estava no comando.
The problem that Kutuzov has, of course, is that he answers to the Tsar of Russia, Alexander. Alexander sees himself as a great leader also. And not surprisingly, if Alexander and Kutuzov don't agree, guess who wins?
O czar Alexandre queria atacar. Queria glória. Eles eram mais numerosos que Napoleão. Era a chance deles para a fama. O plano aliado seria direcionar o exército francês para a direita, de volta ao rio Danúbio. Porém, essa coalizão desorganizada só conseguiu executar sua estratégia 4 dias depois. Isso deu a Napoleão tempo para obter reforços e implementar seu próprio plano magistral.
And he set about in a series of what we would now call psychological operations to entice the Allies into attacking him, which was precisely what Napoleon needed.
One of the things that you never do in military science is to give up a strong position voluntarily, and yet that's exactly what Napoleon was going to do. The area of Austerlitz is dominated by the heights called Pratzen, and he gave up that position to show that he was vulnerable.
Os aliados morderam a isca e foram para as colinas Pratzen, no flanco direito de Napoleão. Secretamente, Napoleão fez 2 corpos marcharem de Viena. Estava decidido a lutar essa batalha sob os seus termos. Ele calculara a distância e velocidade de seus reforços de modo a chegarem quando precisasse.
Certainly he knew the relative strengths of his army and those of the enemy. He took the time to reconnoiter the ground over which he would fight. And he went to lengths to try to find out the psychological makeup, if you will, of his adversaries.
The Russians at one point send an emissary to Napoleon. And this emissary is some young fellow who's full of himself, and he lectures Napoleon on the politics of Europe and on how terrible Napoleon is and the French Revolution and so forth. Napoleon is livid, but he keeps his cool, he sits there and he takes it. This guy goes back and reports, Napoleon is toast. You know, this guy listened to me. He has no faith in his own army anymore. He's on the outs. We can crush Napoleon if only we take action.
A Batalha de Austerlitz não seria apenas um conflito militar, mas também cultural.
These armies really did embody the societies from which they came. The Russian society was one of the cruelest and most autocratic societies on the planet. And the Russian army was composed of serfs who were virtually slaves. Well, the Russians were famous for their tremendous, stolid defense. Napoleon said of them, it wasn't enough to kill a Russian soldier. You had to also go up and knock him over.
The Austrian army was organized in a way where there was a great deal of dependence on communication between various units and a central commander, a commander who might be far to the rear or far to one flank or the other, and it was a very difficult kind of army to maneuver. And to beat Napoleon, you had to be able to maneuver and maneuver quickly.
Uma vantagem tática do exército francês era que ele contava com escaramuçadores, soldados que iam à frente da vanguarda e agiam como atiradores.
Well, if you have soldiers who are patriotic and can be trusted and are motivated, they'll go out and do this sort of duty quite well. They'll show initiative. But on the other hand, if you have an aristocratic army where the soldiers are often there against their will, well, the officers don't trust them to go out on their own and do any fighting. So the French army has a huge advantage.
So the French Revolutionary Army becomes a model for society of being meritocratic, inclusive, egalitarian. And that's why, at least in its initial phases, it was so shocking and devastating.
Em uma noite fria antes da batalha, Napoleão cavalgou entre seus soldados. Era a véspera do primeiro aniversário de sua coroação como imperador da França.
One of the grenadiers of the line regiments takes up a torch, lights it to be his escort to show him the way. Well, that's taken up by another, which is taken up by another, which is taken up by other groups until there are thousands of these torches lit as the emperor makes his way along the lines to the cries of Vive l'Empereur. And until you get this incredible scene of the army being around this beloved general. What's the incredible thing about that story is how that is misinterpreted on the Allied side. Is that even though they see all these torches, even though they hear all this noise, they misinterpret this to meaning that the French army is retreating.
Napoleão ficou comovido com esse espetáculo, ao qual chamou de a maior noite da minha vida. A armadilha de Napoleão para o inimigo estava pronta e ele se sentia confiante. Mas os aliados também. Em 24 horas, a Batalha dos Três Imperadores estaria concluída e um dos impérios aniquilado. Em 2 de dezembro de 1805, ambos os exércitos despertaram em meio à grande neblina que cobria o campo. Napoleão previra que essa neblina cobriria suas tropas auxiliando suas táticas de surpresa. Até então, apostara e ganhara. A Batalha de Austerlitz cobriria um raio de 12 quilômetros, englobando muitas aldeias, riachos, igrejas e um viveiro de fazões. Hoje dizem que os muros do viveiro indicam os locais onde Napoleão posicionou seus canhões voltados para os aliados nas colinas Pratzen. Napoleão tinha olho bom para terrenos. Ele escolhera este local para executar o seu plano de batalha mais ousado. Não só tentaria controlar as ações de seus homens, mas também as dos seus oponentes. Napoleão posicionou seu exército em 3 áreas. O norte, na colina Santon, tinha de ser defendido a todo custo pelo 5º Corpo do Marechal Lannes e pelo 1º do Marechal Bernadotte. Ao centro, o Marechal Soult ocultou seus soldados da vista dos aliados, pronto para retomar as colinas Pratzen. A guarda imperial francesa ficaria de reserva na neblina. Ao sul, o general Langrand tinha apenas 12.000 soldados entre as aldeias de Telnitz e Sokolnitz. Com esse flanco direito frágil, Napoleão pretendia atrair os aliados à sua armadilha. Confusão e desorganização continuaram a perturbar os aliados. A densa neblina envolveu-os pela manhã ao tomarem suas posições em meio ao caos. Do seu posto de comando nas colinas Pratzen, o czar, ansioso pela vitória, ordenou a descida dos aliados rumo ao frágil flanco direito de Napoleão. Eles haviam mordido a isca. Às 6 da manhã, uma guarda austríaca de 5.000 homens atacou a aldeia de Telnitz. Enquanto marchavam pela neblina, os franceses abriram fogo com seus mosquetes Charleville.
They had some strong buildings, like a church, so they were able to implement their strong point defense scheme by putting the better units, the companies of grenadiers, in the church. They covered the village approachways with skirmishers. They then allowed the enemy forces to enter the village and then be counterattacked and trapped in the town, and they inflicted horrible damage on them.
Após uma hora, os franceses expulsaram os austríacos. Embora bem menos numerosos, os franceses mantiveram sua posição, acertando os austríacos com grande destreza. Então, 14 esquadrões de cavalaria aliada irromperam pela aldeia. Os franceses retrocederam e foi enviada aos dois imperadores a notícia de que o plano aliado funcionara.
Those people who were unable to escape just before the battle in these villages like Telpnitz and Solkonitz are suddenly in the middle of a battle where they could be killed by cannonballs, by fire. Men are charging into their homes during the battle, and afterwards their homes are filled by dead and wounded. It was a miserable, horrible situation.
Mas a confusão reinava nas fileiras aliadas. Mapas ainda eram abertos e havia instruções a serem traduzidas. Divisões austríacas chegavam lentamente à aldeia de Solkonitz. O celeiro gigante foi duramente disputado. A esta altura, os aliados pareciam levar vantagem. Do seu posto de comando na colina Zuran, Napoleão observava o movimento dos aliados. Ele teria uma surpresa aguardando por eles.
Napoleon's right flank was secured thanks to the heroic forced march of members of Marshal Davout's Third Corps, who executed one of the most staggeringly arduous forced marches in military history, 70 miles in less than 48 hours. They arrived on the battlefield absolutely exhausted. Over half the men were not present, but still trying to get there.
Até então, os inimigos de Napoleão comportavam-se como se obedecessem às ordens dele. Napoleão quisera que atacassem seu flanco direito e eles atacaram. Graças à marcha forçada, ele agora tinha tropas suficientes para defendê-lo e para executar seu plano, um ataque às colinas Pratzen.
He knew that the men wanted something more than an ordinary victory. And so his battle plan was to give them an extraordinary victory. He was going to let the enemy throw themselves on him, and in the process of doing that, open up themselves for the riposte, and that counterattack would have the effect of splitting the Allied army in two and utterly destroying it.
Napoleão assistia de seu posto de comando, aguardando para fechar sua armadilha no momento certo. Ainda ocultas na neblina no fundo do vale, detrás das colinas Pratzen, estavam as duas divisões, somando 17.000 homens. Quando Napoleão perguntou ao Marechal Soult quanto demoraria para sua guarda secreta capturar o centro, a resposta foi: menos de 20 minutos, sire. O imperador deu ordem de avançar. Com um golpe certeiro, e a guerra terminará.
On the first anniversary of his coronation, Napoleon launched the most daring plan ever to attack two of the oldest empires in Europe and teach them a serious lesson in modern warfare. Up until this point, Napoleon's battle at Austerlitz had been a masterpiece of deception. Now, he ordered his troops to advance straight through the morning fog and straight at the emperors of Austria and Russia.
He waited until exactly the proper moment to launch a violent counterattack in the center of the Allied army. It was a brilliant plan, magnificently executed,
They began to sweep across the valley and go up to the Pratzen Heights. Just about that time, the famous sun of Austerlitz begins to burn the mist away. And the Allies looked down in amazement to see a rather sizable French force storming up at them.
Desde esse dia, Napoleão associou aquele sol vermelho com a sua glória e a de seu grande exército. O fulgurante sol de Austerlitz aqueceria Napoleão pelos próximos 10 anos. Enquanto isso, o czar Alexandre, o general Kutuzov e o imperador Francisco viam, horrorizados, as divisões francesas materializando-se como fantasmas saídos da neblina. Napoleão declarou: "Eles se creem derrotados pela metade, ainda esperam vencer-me. Vamos concluir esta campanha com uma trovoada que atordoará o inimigo." Às 9h30 da manhã, os franceses subiram a colina em meio a balas de mosquete e de canhão. A 100 metros dos aliados, abriram fogo, demolindo o centro da posição aliada. Às 10 horas, os franceses haviam retomado todos os baluartes aliados. A última esperança de vitória da Terceira Coalizão era enviar o seu esquadrão de elite, a Guarda Imperial Russa. Às 13 horas, 3.000 veteranos russos romperam a vanguarda francesa com um formidável ataque de baionetas.
The typical bayonet of the Napoleonic era was a triangular sectioned piece of steel about 15 inches long. It was fitted to the end of the bayonet via a right-angled slot with a locking ring. Now, while the bayonet charge was a proud tradition, it took an extremely well-disciplined and highly trained soldier to make a run at a line of muskets armed only with a bayonet. In fact, the bayonet charge was most effective when it was used against an enemy that was already beaten, an enemy that would just turn and run. Ah! Of course, when two soldiers actually did meet at bayonet point on the battlefield, all of that textbook move and fancy footwork went right out the window. It was stab, slash, jab, smash, gouge, rip, anything that'd keep you alive for the next 30 seconds.
Um ataque da cavalaria russa aproveitou-se dessa brecha, fazendo os franceses recuarem das colinas Pratzen. Napoleão convocou então uma divisão extra, a cavalaria mameluca.
The Mamelukes were almost a living souvenir of Napoleon's famous expedition to Egypt. And they were most noted for their famed weapon, which was a curved sword known as the scimitar.
They were the most vicious and effective fighters on horseback that one could possibly imagine. In the course of their action, they utterly demolished one squadron of the Tsar's finest horsemen. There's even one story about a trooper named Mustafa that cut off the head of a standard bearer of the 3rd Squadron of the Chevalier Guards, took the color, and for that was given the Légion d'honneur.
Por 15 minutos, a fumaça ocultou a luta das vistas dos 3 imperadores. Quando a fumaça se dissipou, os granadeiros franceses e os mamelucos haviam massacrado os russos. Napoleão recebeu um estandarte de volta e 1.000 prisioneiros, incluindo um príncipe. O centro dos aliados foi destruído. Os soldados do Marechal Soult voltaram-se para o sul para virar o flanco esquerdo dos aliados.
Suddenly, they find themselves with the French in the center on the Pratzen Heights. The right flank of Napoleon is over here, and the Austrians are caught in the middle. It's a hammer against an anvil, and the Austrian army is absolutely decimated.
Com a aproximação dos franceses, o combate corpo a corpo recomeçou. Baionetas estripavam, mãos decepadas voavam para a indignação dos franceses. Eles pararam de fazer prisioneiros e puseram-se a chacinar unidades inteiras de russos, levando suas roupas e botas. Os franceses avançaram, bloqueando a retirada dos exaustos aliados. O meio mais rápido de escapar do perigo era cruzando um lago congelado. Napoleão observava de uma pequena capela quando o caos teve início.
The Russian and Austrian retreat over the frozen lake is another one of those sort of propaganda myth moments of the battle. When you read many of the French accounts, well, you have 5, 6, 7,000 guys falling through the ice in this dramatic moment.
One particular source, I believe he's Austrian, says that soon after the battle, those ponds were drained and there was only 2 bodies found. So here on the one hand, you have this legend of the ponds where these thousands of fleeing soldiers are finding their icy death, and on the other extreme, there's only 2 bodies to be found. Certainly the truth lies somewhere in between.
Às 17 horas, a Batalha de Austerlitz teve fim. 15.000 soldados aliados morreram e 12.000 foram aprisionados. Apenas 1.300 franceses perderam a vida. O czar insistira em lutar essa batalha. Se tivesse seguido o conselho de Kutuzov, o destino da Terceira Coalizão e de Napoleão teria sido diferente.
The sheer disparity in casualties is certainly a strong argument for how brilliant Napoleon's plans was. But also, one of the most important things is the number of flags that were captured from the enemy and the number of cannons. Remember that these were aristocratic armies. Honor was everything. And for an infantry regiment or a cavalry regiment, their flag, their standard, was an enormous symbol. It was an absolute disgrace to lose it. Napoleon, the first thing he wanted to know after battle wasn't how many did we kill, but how many flags have we got, how many cannons have we captured. That's how he knew how badly beaten the enemy was.
Em Austerlitz, Napoleão capturou 183 canhões e 45 estandartes. À tarde, um Napoleão exausto retirou-se para o velho correio e aguardou a rendição dos aliados. Enquanto isso, nas adegas, seus soldados quebravam os barris e comemoravam sua vitória regados de vinho. Em 4 de dezembro de 1805, o imperador Francisco pediu a paz. Uma batalha ocorreu hoje, escreveu ele à sua esposa, mas o resultado não foi muito bom. Assinou-se um armistício no Château Austerlitz, outrora uma base dos imperadores aliados.
Austria was humiliated by their defeat. They were forced to give up virtually all of the territory that they controlled in northern Italy and all of the territory that they controlled in southern Germany. And indeed, the old Holy Roman Empire, as it was known, was pretty much over as a result of the Battle of Austerlitz. The Russians didn't really have to give up anything, but they did suffer the humiliation of being forced to withdraw.
Hoje, o campo de batalha fica na República Tcheca e é conhecido como Islakov-Uberna. Nas colinas Pratzen ergue-se um monumento de 21 metros, marcando o local onde milhares morreram bravamente.
What caused the French to win the battle was Napoleon. There's an old saying that no plan survives contact with the enemy, and this is exactly the opposite of that. Not only did Napoleon's plan work for him, his plan for the coalition worked right into his hands.
Napoleon fought and won more battles under varying climatic conditions than any other commander in history. From the snows of Central Europe, the sands of Egypt, there were a lot of battles that were politically more important than Austerlitz, but it certainly can be argued that none militarily were greater.
Napoleon had conquered Austria and regained Italy. His battle plan at Austerlitz had elevated his legend to new heights. He was never more admired or feared. Napoleon had seemingly risked everything and yet won his greatest victory. It would be the defining moment in an otherwise unequaled military career. I'm Captain Dale Dye. Thanks for watching Conquerors.